Plurality and impending final resolution. 6/24/2012. Thoughts on the Lotus Wand. Much of this writing stems from a conversation that I've had with a good friend, written from earlier today. Much of the second half consists of elaboration done independently. I see now what King College represents. It is a hospital and medical education center, as it is so related. My God, from what my friend tells me in the description of the place, the condition seems to be horrible. Such a condition can be immediately and completely correlative with so many other parts of America, as it is so far becoming. The very town that I had lived in during my stay at my Quebecy father's, indeed it was a foreign country, absolutely without denial. There was no opportunity to make friends with anyone on the street whatever. Most of them were concerned with, when approached by others like my own, of affirming their hatred for the few and rarely cited American Germanics that they would, by chance, see now in this particular city. Over the course of a decade, I had witnessed nearly an entire negative transformation of a town, from a rather friendly, sociable, and civil society to practically a third-world subhuman wasteland, with thug warfare dominating seemingly, possibly soon, ultimately, every aspect of the street. Graffiti abounding everywhere, repeatedly on walls, wherein a homeowner would vainly yet repeatedly attempt to paint over it, month after month or week after week. Seemingly 1 out of every 10 cars that would blast the most subhuman and primitive of thumps and mechanistic pounds that would recall to the mind the most horrifying inhumanism and hollow animalistic determinism. There were everywhere shufflers and oafs, pack riots and slime. The occasional racist rally where foreign and very unreliable unassociated flags were being waved in the very land that they were and are remaining in opposition to and desirous to overrun. There was eventually found and discovered a tremendous abundant, complete catalogical evidence that the southern Amerindian man collects together with every one of his allies, which are none together Western or fair-skinned whatsoever. His alliance with Western men is very flimsy. When exposed and running wild in the street, his opposition is immediately understood to be total. He desires to deconstruct every aspect and trace of the white man within the 2 American continents, to throw him back to Europa, he will say. Every movement of civic progression, creative evolution, common brotherhood is denied, for it appears alien to his very partisan interests, even after the white man continuously and consistently intends to demonstrate and to integrate, equalize, show compassion, mercy, apology, and so on to the prior person that had earlier spread here without his knowledge of the Western man traced throughout the land. He denies the nobleman's effort, reduces his mentality and spirit of historical time to the year prior to 1492, during which he thinks it would be appropriate to start over without any of the white man's conquest at this time. I can only imagine the immediate decline that his spirit of late medieval times, we should now remember, would affect the society if ever the white man suddenly was to disappear without a trace from the New World, from the southern Amerindian man, so takes the reins of the government over the various New World states. The consequence would be undeniably devastating. The spirit that appears easily medieval, to borrow education from Spengler, whether or not that he says this thought himself, as it appears easily observable by the mere typical unenlightened countenance that he exhibits and expresses to himself and others during any normal state's waking observation. The whole socio-political movement is thoroughly ridiculous. It is easily observable that this man, especially, is personally at war with the white man, that he admits of no toleration or final understanding of his enemy to be done. Not even after this white man desires to show love, kindness, and such to others, and even a general, universal, and all-inclusive sense of the word, the noblest of interests. Time after time again, I had experienced such effects of foreign racial prejudice and discrimination against my character by this man, instantaneously at that, for I couldn't help myself not to be white and to be one of him. A pack mentality everywhere, the mocking, humiliating laughter that he exhibits and expresses, a complete scorn of high-end thoughts and typical white man intellect. The education system is utterly in want to affect positively young minds anymore. I held first-hand experience of this during the transformation that was occurring over the past decade in my town into a bitter racist slum. I would attempt to play a beautiful classical song on the classroom stereo when time allowed of it. With the characteristic pack, group, or quasi-tribe mentality, with suspicions coupled with scowls, negations, curses, the distinct mocking laughter that is exhibited and expressed, this all would typically occur in any similar occasion which I would attempt to establish. As well experienced personally was the exceedingly frequent usage of this native, extremely unreliable, unagreeable tongue of the wet, putrid, rapidly unthinking Latin, romantic Spanish, in direct contrast to that of the dry, noble, slow, and timely reasoning grammatic English language. Incidences of this were infinite. The one that would speak the English tongue with a firm grasp on it would continue to revert to his own partiality, even upon the perceived occasion that a couple of them together could speak the former just as well. He prefers the simpler, shallower, nicer thoughts that the Spanish language contends for him, in spite of the very damage that the state he walks upon is not Spanish in spirit. I think by now that with all this adequate reasoning that it would be sound enough to finally take serious effort in eradicating this pestilence through some means. The language, the custom, and mannerism, which has so far produced barely any relevance or creative productivity key or inspiration to the orthodox Western spirit throughout the entire past decade. Nothing more than a peculiar method of slave morality that insists upon doubting with the most irritating skepticism all and any ambitious desires, great hopes, and similar great postures and healthy conduct found in the man of flesh that he instantaneously determines to hate, immediately chooses to deny understanding of him. I could write endlessly about how glaring and immediately evident that this tremendous flaw has undergone, that during these past few centuries, the very Kali Yuga that I speak of, the tide of it appears to be expanding and developing drastically before any coming hope or opportunity may save the West from complete disintegration into an easily understandable third world state that it is ultimately becoming toward. Here in the New World, along with all the prior inductions that I'm making, it is evident to even the most callous observer that some of these ideas appear real, perhaps that he has some insight to gain, some knowledge to learn, to course in his experience, to prepare himself before what is going to be, of course, the inevitable racial domination by this particular above-mentioned man throughout what will all be the remaining of the West in a few centuries to come. And you care less and less for one remaining concealed or soft-spoken or obscure in my thoughts in regard to this very timely subject, that I do not care to take the risk of offense to the pusillanimous liberal in particular. The sole object of task of all any remaining orthodox Westerners that deserves of any immediate remedy. However, this is of course to be unlikely, or care at the risk of offense to the enemy, particularly the general politically motivated Southern Amerindian man, for a reason that I feel must oppose and counter-respond to the very bitter and prejudiced transactions that I had very frequently and abundantly experienced during this past decade from him. Also, too, I do care less and less about any political motivation that, as I understand, the time is to come, the time is to soon come that I will perpetually annihilate my will. It's extremely meaningful and has an intricate explanation involved. I've decided that I wish to write extensively upon this topic, that of which I have discovered made principle as of rather recent. To say, I understand that my life is a transmigration of precisely or possibly 12 singular souls, or rather lifetimes, that with the first initial life it has undergone under the astrological zodiacal sign of Piscis, that then this first life deceases, I'm then reborn under the sign of Aquarius, then I decease and reconceive under Capricorn, then Sagittarius, then Scorpio, then Libra. All these lives so far have been completed and finished by my soul already. I'm currently under the sign of Taurus, it's my second to last and penultimate life before I hit the sign of Aries. This being the last, most red, most fierce experience that I will undergo, I will then afterward obliterate or evaporate in the wind from sudden death and spiritual exhaustion and annihilation. I think that during my Aries life that I will be reborn during some time, but what is understood to be the historical future of this life's conception, during a very radically and racially disturbed time, again that all transmigration of souls shall occur between one and the same form, spirit and substance, at least as I know it in my case. As it is seen, during the life of Piscis, the representative color signifying the idea of it is violet, or purple, that is, a simple and easygoing color that reflects the novice beginner-like difficulty that this particular life shall entail. With Aquarius, the color changes slightly, that it increases to a relative degree, reflecting a more difficult setting. With Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, and so on. With the sign of Scorpio, the color is blue-green, signifying, according to what I believe from the irrefutable source of the Kabbalah, a drier, more fiery, further cry from the now distant, more easy-going life colors under the former Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Piscis signs. By the time of Leo, the color is yellow. There appears the introduction of conception of Satan, or at least the ego in its most significant form. The two signs of Cancer and Gemini follow with their transparency of color, likely to signify cast doubt upon what is becoming accordingly evidence of the successive chain of lives. The principal source of reference to this entire theory stems from the Golden Dawn lotus wand, with its stem of zodiacal colors arranged from Piscis to Aries, from the magician's palm to the tip's end, the end signifying spiritual annihilation and thus nirvana, that the instrument in itself signifies metempsychosis. Thus, with Taurus, the sign of which currently represents the soul, with the current life, it correlates with the bull. It is heavy and grave, earthy and terrible. It correlates with the letter Wow within the Hebrew language, with which this letter in turn means a pin or hook, that this present life consistently recalls catching or capturing something, that this signifies probably knowledge. Very likely this correlating with this is on the Tarot Major Arcana, the card Hierophant, which changes with the Popa, the teacher, the educator, the philosopher, in the communitarian sense, a life searching for just this very singular thing, the one. What truly is this one that is so frequently alluded to, so vague and mysterious in its own definition? Well, it is the one that is the last life, that the current threshold of matter, the will, and the principle of sufficient reason, time, space, and causality, and such have in common to live. The life that is of Aries, the constant reference and rumination to power, hardness, severity, the color red, the planet Mars, Homeric Nietzschean idealization, the grandeur of classicism and of Roman imperialism, the determination of logic and the necessity of the will, the knowledge of total obliteration through cessation of the soul, the fear of darkness, the fear of injustice, of wickedness. But Diamond Head's words, "Am I evil? Yes, I am." So that by the time of the Arius life formulation, the color that signifies, of course, red. Also, the course and path to the end of the soul is not directed downward, like for instance as though on the Kabbalah, life were thought to be descended from one Keter to 10 Malkuth, or on the Tarot from Fool to World, or on the Zodiac from Arius to Piscis. As earlier explained, this is not so. Rather, the chain of course and direction is upward, or if not, a better word, toward Godhead, toward immanence, from 10 Malkuth to 1 Keter, from Piscis on the Zodiac to Arius. Of course, it must be explained on the Tarot. I recognize that the course on the Major Arcana is not from one absolute direction to the other, like for instance from the World to the Fool. Rather, what zodiac sign during life, in its spiritual appearance, reflects the corresponding trump card on the Major Arcana Tarot. It is that particular Tarot trump card that represents the knowing subject's current position in life. It also corresponds with its relative astrological sign, such that with Piscis, the trump card called into question is the Moon. With Scorpio, it is Death. With Cancer, it is the Chariot. With Taurus, it is the Hierophant, as was stated above. With Arius, it is the Emperor. Naturally, the Emperor appears and represents as a being almost akin to God himself, standing before the gateway to total annihilation of the subject's life and soul. By this time in the subject's life, everything that is hard and red is universally recollected, as this correlates with the above, that racial miscegenation will be thorough, or at least as ultimately conceived as it ever can be, for the subject's undergoing his chain, reason, and movement of 12 lives, as it now appears under the first and the last, that is, the life under Arius. I don't know whether after Arius the life and soul of the world can appear conceived again, perhaps not in these eyes, as though there are in fact a multitude of souls, egos, selves, and I ams within the will of the universe, that not every cause and effect revolves around one subject, but again the skepticism is reassured. None of this speculation seems truly knowable. However, I think it is reasonable enough, more so that I can feel it, at least to the point that when I reflect emotionally upon it, the thought becomes a conviction merely, for it is providing me with the most reasonable and purposive life that I can possibly ever after ascertain. The Arius will come, the subject will suffer excruciating pain and torment during the final life, the Lord will come, the eye will break, and it will be over. It is not something by chance, or something as though that one may try to go against a certain knowledge with the conceited intention to effect a change or transformation away from the determination of clockwork activity that represents fate and necessity itself. Regardless whether I think that I can do otherwise, for so thinking is mere delusion, nothing can be done to alter the will, the very reason, the motives, the activity, the consequences that guide the sphere of the Son of God, in this case myself as one, as otherwise I will fancy to act outside my very nature and attempt to effect karma throughout the current portion of my life, in my current Taurus form, doing so while I still can. But then, when I die, what then? It is obviously inevitable that I shall conceive the Arius form, regardless of what I wish. The whole reason behind this is like watching a preconceived film, done so through God's eyes, or at least through the sons of God, that I am one of these in a particular case, so that all of the karma that I produce, the effects, negative or not, are already preconceived and known to follow, by God or by the will of nature alone, and life ultimately moves on to the next one, in a further difficult, trying, contesting setting. During the time that I'm under the sign of Taurus, I see that I have acquired enough right knowledge to find myself to act reasonably, sufficiently, and wisely so, that by now in the sequential time, no foolish, undesirable acts of egoism or malicious selfishness affect my character or train of spiritual procession. By now I'm becoming ready to die again, but then by Arius to finally perish. By the time of Arius I will possibly appear to attain my wisest self, by the accumulation and experience of all in the past lives of wisdom, thus affecting the growth of my new character, coupled together with what positive knowledge that still preserves and retains itself in the society of that future time for storage in my soon-to-be Arius life. I salute all that remains of my dying civilization. Perhaps my friend does have a spirit a part of me, that perhaps hers is a part of a longer chain outlasting that of my own, that one day she herself shall greet the dawn of a sunny horizon of Spenglerian springtime revival of Western Occidental culture, or at least that she may see a revival of the grammatics, as her spirit, that is in the transmigration process, if it is true that she is independent of my will, is likely going to travel from grammatic, Teutonic to Teutonic until her own end. I think that it would be quite a sight to see, the greatest sight, I believe, to behold the very spiritual community at last that both she and I together have for so long awaited to see and to experience it in all of its youth, creativity, and cultural glory once again. With much indebtedness to the Mediterranean spirit as well, likewise the Hindu. I personally don't believe that I will see this in my lifetime, but she herself may very well experience such a grand moment. The knowledge of her zodiac sign, which is currently being acquired, shall undoubtedly shed more light upon the occasional recollections that her spirit and character signifies and desires, through understanding the sign that governs her. Thus, the correlating correlating trump card, thus the correlating trump card, the Hebrew letter and its corresponding meaning, and so on. That is, if she is truly alive and independent of my will, which I'm beginning to believe that she truly is, as are others in general. The science of time, space, and causality seems to demonstrate this theory more successfully to me, but it does seem likewise to be very well be a delusion that matter does not exist or move, as Parmenides has it, that all of the universe is one total enclosed sphere within an infinite void, with the absolute center being the most potent aspect of God in this particular universe. The sphere is akin to molecule and atom, capable of reverse magnification. To zoom out further enough from our perception, we will inevitably see another atom somewhere within this infinite void, one that composes of another universe, possibly another soul, that with another distance of perception a clear expression will be made up and composed, that an image and representation of an entire universe is to eventually be in itself complete. The spheres of the prior dominion of universes compose up as the atoms of this present more super universe, creating its own distinct, unique space, time, and causality, its own absolute center. Again, the most potent aspect of God, so much as it appears within this universal sphere, its own nebulae, galaxies, star systems, planets, and spiritual worlds, where life potentially exists in its forms, in contrast to the prior described smaller makeup of universal spheres and atoms. This procedure outward to further and further universes composed of prior universe atoms appears infinite, but perhaps consists of 10 dominions, or possibly even 12, as correspondent to the signs of the zodiac, with the smallest universe representing Piscis, with the greatest and grandest representing Arius, the sum acquisition of souls in a spiritual journey. Again, perhaps each and every atom within one dominion represents a conscious soul in some way, in some form, that the atoms within one particular universe sphere are not infinite, as it is mentioned earlier that the universe sphere of one particular universe is evidently finite and limited in space, so that a finite amount of matter populates the particular universe, that this particular universe is governed by one conscious soul in some way, in some form. Upon the soul's death in one of the dominions, it releases itself and transcends to the higher dominion. But this seems preposterous, as it is explained that only one soul governs one universal sphere, within whatever grade of dominion it appears in. Following through with the thought of there being 10 or 12 grades of transcending dominions, corresponding in the case of 12 to the signs of the zodiac, that upon Aries, the pinnacle sign, the soul inevitably deceases. Thus, with nothing further to achieve, attains nirvana. But with the irrefutable axiom that nothing is eternal, the soul must inevitably spring back into being, starting in the Piscis dominion, the lowest grade of the Godhead dominions, the grade of reference to the lowest weakest sign in the zodiac. Ultimately, it becomes apparent that everything, every atom, universal or molecular, is infinite in space, even after having set up the hypothesis that there are about 10 or 12 graded universal dominions, perceived like fractals or Leibnizian monads. The theory is instead elaborated further that with the decease of one soul having passed through the entire grades of the zodiacal corresponding dominions, nirvana, or rather peculiar form of moksha or samadhi, is attained, that God, as the totality of everything, every atom, whether universal or molecular, ceases to exist for precisely the same amount of successive time that the particular conscious soul preserved its life cycle, that with its soul alive during the great Piscis, time flows exceedingly fast, proportionally so, in contrast to the greater universe Aquarius, where here this universe, its time flows slower, its space is more great in dimension, its cause and effect method more complicated, intelligent, difficult, and advanced. This relation proceeds onward to Capricorn, where in time flows ever slower, space is greater and more dimensional, cause and effect more intelligent, but peculiar in its own unique way, as the grade corresponds to the universe's zodiacal relations, such that with here Capricorn represents a dark blue color, thus the Capricorn grade and dominion correlate with that particular color's significance, so on and so forth, up to Aries, wherein Aries, the time of this particular universal dominion flows slowest, the soul endures longest life experience, the space is greatest and more dimensional, the cause and effect appropriate to the corresponding grades zodiacal sign. Now, upon the total death of the soul, it seems that after the necessary lapse of time of not being, and the soul follows, that the soul rebirths by the reason of God, and thus effectively transcends its former 12 dominions and moves on to a greater 12 dominions to complete another total life journey. This process likely endures infinitely and eternally. If not, then the soul merely does not transcend to an even greater 12 dominion realm after rebirth, but merely starts over in one 12 dominion of the same size as the prior one. the power won during his last total death. I reasoned that this theory of 12 dominions corresponding to the zodiac may very well likely be transposed with the theory of 10 dominions, that of which each grade of universal sphere and soul represents one sephira upon the Kabbalistic tree of life. 10 sephirot exist, of course. Here it is supposed that the soul starts off in the universe sphere atom of 10 and Malkut, thus makes his way accordingly in the same nature as described above regarding the zodiac procession, with time becoming slower during each consecutive succession of sephira and such. Also that in regard to the nature of the cause and effect, its degree and grade of intelligence and complication involved with each certain sephira. Here, knowledge of each grade will be obtained simply by referring to the nature and signification behind the particular sephira that the soul's current position within the universal dominion holds. For instance, that the soul undergoing a lifetime within 10 Malkuts, then the science of cause and effect in this soul's particular lifetime represents just what the sephira of 10 Malkuts universally signifies: earthiness, heaviness, density, gravity, weight, smallness of relative scope, in contrast to all of the soon to be preceding sephirot, multiplicity, plurality, deep confusion, and so on and so forth. In any event, it follows that with every universal sphere, a lifetime is caused into being, that within one grade of the total 10 or 12 dominion, a finite number of atoms compose a universe. That space is finite and limited in this respect, finite and limited so far as one universe sphere is concerned within one grade of the total dominion. There exists for every atom within that grade a soul that governs that particular universe sphere within that grade, so that with one universe soul perishing, it proceeds to transcend further onto the next greater grade of the total dominion. The prior universe does not annihilate or disappear, as matter is not perishable. It simply becomes wasteful and radioactive, hence the signification found in this particular planet Earth, within this particular universe sphere, that recalls and recollects to the conscious soul that particular idea of nuclear waste, radioactivity, radiation, and such. So that it would seem to follow that eventually, with enough time and perishing of souls, that the entire total dominion of God would become completely radioactive and uninhabitable by souls. However, this is not the case, as God and everything that he represents ultimately represents infinity, that the total dominion becomes a corpse. Then time elapses and follows amply enough, wherein consciousness and soul ceases to exist in itself, then erases the burden of its past, and respawns anew the very absolute idea of the total universal dominion, consisting of 10 grades, each containing atomic matter. That each atom represents a universe in itself. Zooming in on our perception, we shall descend to lower grades, such as from 9 Yesod to 10 Malkut, or from Aquarius to Piscis, or zooming out our perception, we shall ascend to higher grades, such as from Taurus to Aries, or from 2 Chokmah to 1 Keter. Now it is to be remarked that if conscious in the grade of 10 Malkut or Piscis, that zooming in our perception we should logically not arrive to any smaller atoms universes. This is either understood to be true, if so, then in the sense that consciousness of soul within this particular grade of universe will correspond logically to its significant components, the knowledge acquired from insight into the signification behind 10 Malkut and Piscis, that this respective sephira, the sign, indicates primitiveness and lowness of evolution in the spiritual forms, that intelligence of soul will not be developed enough in this lowest of states to inquire into the nature of atomic matter. However, then, what precisely makes up matter within this grade of dominion? Again, the soul is extremely small in this state, similar and reminiscent to singular-celled organisms on this planet. Again, this planet's recollection of divine transcendental ideas found further and further away from this particular soul, so that potentially everything springs from one, again, more local signification. That in this lowest grade of dominion, none but one atom exists, that of which the entire successive universe spheres are consecutively built upon more greatly in size, time, and intellect. Also, it would follow that at Aries, or 1 Keter, no higher grade of universe exists beyond it. Thus, subsequently, the void itself would either necessarily end at the grade's limits, or proceed onward boundlessly and infinitely, which seems absurd at first. However, it finds confirmation with Kabbalah. Once again, this seemingly irrefutable system, with the aspect being considered of Ein, Ein Soap, and Ein Soap R. Nothing at first, a dead limit, thus Ein. Then perceived extension, albeit limited, but still void, this Ein Soap. This particular void I find most difficult to comprehend sufficiently. Then finally the very limitless and infinite void of nothingness is achieved, this Ein Soap R, with perpetual reflections of light from the prior dominions received, following in accordance with the Kabbalistic system's typical theory of Ein Soap R, consisting of infinite and boundless light. In any event, to return earlier, to finish a prior statement, it seems likely that with the opposite direction of magnification of spheres, this shall uphold sufficiently as well, that if magnification to one of this universe's own universal atoms was conceived close enough, that then could potentially follow the appearance of whole nebulae, galaxies, star systems, planets, and spiritual worlds likewise to become discovered, so further on to the very basest limit, as it goes the same for our perceptions, reverse telescopic magnification, further and further outward into larger space, onto the limit of Godhead. Recommended is the study or acquaintance of mathematical fractals, as well as study into Leibniz's modalology, also as it goes for one universe alone. To regard our universe in this case, the further the distance apart from the center, the more the aspects of time, space, and causality bear their significance, and that softness, fluidity, movement, and life, matriarchal delusion get their they get the character, even though these ultimately spring from the potent absolute center, which consists of total will and imperial statehood, that is absent of all in any motion, substance, and wanting desire. June 24, 2012. Seven 2012. God, reason, and infinity. Desire emerges and formulates into necessity, but what exactly is this desire? Can it define itself precisely through the means of the English language as I know it? This speech is not perpetually fixed, that even if I were to manage to find a sufficient definition, time would proceed with its rendering effects of decadence and transformation. I would no longer be understood. Am I being something to begin with? Perhaps. So if it were true, I may attempt to define what I am reasonably and successfully. I commence with the various list of nouns and verbs, descriptions that seem to support and uphold my apparent being. I am white, for one thing. I receive a severe burn all around my flesh. It leaves to me a permanent non-whitish scarring. I no longer can consider myself white as such, so that I recall the absolute expression "I am white," then conclude afterward that I am not so, for my flesh no longer appears as such due to the burnt deformation. Consequently, I perceive an answer from above. I am even capable of knowing this answer before as well, when I were not burnt and my flesh were still white. No, you are not white, for eventually I become deformed and burnt to the flesh. Another example is stated, I am tall. I come across a man of fantastic height in comparison to my own. Or even simpler, a measurement is made between my height and a skyscraper, or even the height of the atmosphere before entering into outer space. These two measurements in comparison to my own height render to me the impression of my sincere shortness, that I perceive myself tall at once, state that I am as such, then eventually come to the conclusion that I no longer am. The voice states again, no, you're not tall. The same illustration is applicable for expressions of shortness, that as though I state absolutely that I am short, a mere perception of a serpent, an insect, or molecular particle standing in comparison to my height destroys this illusion. It seems that, taking with myself all of this investigation's judgment and conclusion, I may reason well enough the reality of an absolute statement appearing true at first. However, in each case, upon further investigation, the examples it affords are necessarily concluded as false, or at least short-sighted and not worked through enough completely. It becomes knowledgeable to understand that I am nothing more than an appearance of some expression, of some representation. I cannot know myself completely without a description of some sort, but even this description must meet a standard that is not delusional, misshapen, or unsatisfactory. If I were to state that I am strong, then in order for this premise to be correct, or to appear correct, I must specify that 1. I am strong in relation to some particular thing, and thus render the statement non-absolute, as though if it were a universal, then it would leave the statement appearing to say that I am the strongest being in the universe, that this is of course not true, and 2. I do not define strength in itself, but rather appear or seem to be strong, so that the premise renders itself not as a fact, but rather as a speculative belief, open to doubt and reformulation, as it follows. The thought of my strength projects in a relative measurement to some other object or essence. Now, this train of thought, especially when applied to speech, appears satisfactory to judgment, that logic understands the nature of the world as one not of being or absolute definition, but rather one of appearance and almost infinite representation. Of course, this very world that I speak of, the nature and law behind its forces, is determined by reason and necessity. There is essentially and fundamentally no will within it, as Schopenhauer expounds the term. Rather, the only concepts applicable and faithful to its name express thoughts and words such that are delusional, for instance, emotion, choice, decision, liberty. This list of terms represents concepts that appear possible to enforce. However, upon further investigation, the ideas are considered impossible, erroneous, and mistaken. For example, the nature of the world consists of motion. The only form the consciousness can apprehend is an appearance that is formed through motion. This motion is causation, for all motion is a cause and effect from prior reasoning. This latter term, causation, is synonymous with the law of cause and effect. Motion and causation are the law of everything, of matter, whether it appears from within or from without the mind. The law dictates the course of motion, consciousness, and subjective life, from beginning to end. No action is freely executed without prior reasoning and motive gathered from above. Causation is the inevitable legislation of phenomenology. It serves to clarify the world is not so entirely solipsistic, absolute, and self-centered as it once seemed, for a change is being performed in every corner and crevice of the universe under the concepts of both time and space, that the subject is born into a world already having before him a chain of reasoning that is continuously and perpetually defining every moment and position of matter during the farthest recollection into the past and also the farthest potentiality into the future, as well as in every position throughout the threshold of space and matter. Here it seems knowledgeable that every aspect of the universe is already created, subsisted, and done, for all causation and motion are actually knowable completely, if only the subject were wise enough to apprehend it. If this investigation follows through more completely, the thought of the subject seeming to be apparent is actually appearing as such through one form and another over time. As the theme from earlier above explains, even the subject cannot be eternal. He is here, changing and transforming from one life to the next, as his being postulates one absolute notion, and with the successive reiteration of this notion through death and thence rebirth, he becomes apparent through another absolute being notion, so that it appears that the idea of being is not so entirely ruled out as something impossible in phenomenology to conceive. It merely conceives itself as a subject matter of error and misshape, only to change, transform, and succeed long enough until the right and correct premise is found, hence to resolve itself afterward accordingly. This logic is referable to the theories found in Hegel's dialectic, that is, of the notion of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, one supplanting the other until a spiritually sublime state is discovered and preserved. In Hegel's case, in historical time, possibly the pristine state of the Holy Roman Empire, with the notion that time and space guide and follow themselves under the law of causation, that with one apparent cause and effect issuing forth, insight into the particular details of the principle are a delusion. A moment in time can be discovered, and a position in space is also discovered, while simultaneously causality springs forth further into time and space, guided by the inescapable law of reason and necessity. Now, what moment in time and what position in space can become discovered without there being a mode, vehicle, or method available to apprehend the matter as discovered? Obviously, a subject of some kind must provide the form suitable to this task. If any detail in time and space are to be apprehended, either through physical sense impression or through abstract ideas of memory or imagination, then a subject of some form must be conceived at first hand, and given the absolute knowing perspective characteristic of a phenomenal being. It becomes evident eventually that this subject of absolute knowing is God's right-hand man. Many implications abound from this, one in particular being the notion, speculative and possible of course, that feminine, animal, and plant natures do not perceive at first hand with the absolute knowing perspective, that these particular objects of manifestation are mere phantoms to the subject's dream and thus devoid of spiritual content. It seems that only one man, God's right-hand son, the Chokmah Sephirah on the Kabbalistic tree of life, 2 Wisdom Ray Uranus Herschel, father of man and the son of God, proceeds through the chain of reason accordingly, with as many successions and reiterations of expression and representation, whether it be fleeting qualities bound within his person, or whole life sentences transformed and determined according to God's, i.e. reasons and preference. Thus I have it established that nothing in the subject universe is eternal or everlasting, that everything is rather, instead, forever undergoing change and transformation. But I have it as well that reason forms the subject, his consciousness, his field and threshold of knowledge, as though absolute perfection were attempted and sought after for the subject time and again, but that, as illustrated earlier above, the subject postulates an absolute premise, stating that he is certainly one solitary thing. Then through the antithesis of the opposition, the subject's thesis or initial premise is destroyed, thus he transcends to the higher form of perfection, repeating this process until the summit of his capacity is reached, then likely obtaining the gift of immortality. So, in effect, knowledge of absolutism remains affirmative insofar as reason dictates the procession of the subject's assumed absolute forms accordingly. which to this end always remains correct, as the law and principles of reason is infallible and inescapable of everything. With this explanation being made, I turn to the idea expanded upon earlier in a former writing, the second half of Thoughts on the Lotus Wand, that all this theory and speculation to the thought that time, space, and causation are perhaps something real and actual. Rather, instead, I have already concluded that such concepts behind and a part of the principle of sufficient reason are in fact false and no more than an erroneous delusion. It is tricky and cunning to the observer when these forms of the principle are in full procession. As the harder and more real these forms become, the further and further away is the subject's object of immortality distanced from him. With time and space appearing more and more real to the subject, he falls into the trap of absolute thoughts applied to infinitely and endlessly changing material. Space is more real. He observes and examines objects with a limited scope of perception, denies and forgets their potentiality of destruction, amendment, or transformation. Thus is excessive and unnecessary astonishment when he sees the object reformed to some new expression of itself, and so forth. As for time, a terrible boredom overcomes his patience. He loses himself almost immediately in the seemingly infinite succession of moments in the form of time. He soon declares its essence as something undesirable to apprehend, as the moments are authentically impossible to preserve and to keep account of. As causality is applied to time, he observes the various historical epochs and contemplates the revelation of those to come. However, he recognizes the truth that everything ultimately perishes. In regard to the past, that this has already become as such. Also in regard to the future, he may look forward with what may perhaps become. However, the notion of death and transformation of everything consistently pervades his reasoning, rightly and wisely so that again his attention is directed back towards something higher and transcendent from this mundane realm of thinking. As it goes for causality, as God, i.e. reason, directs the motives and resolutions of the universal soul's actions, it would seem impossible to transcend from this form of the principle that with every cause and effect issued forth, a moment's time is created, a position in space is likewise created, causality remains inescapable. As reason explained above is the motive, action, and course of everything in the subject's dominion, the dominion that is of God's right hand man, the Father of all, the Son of God. If causality, coupled along with reason, with this necessity and determination, are inevitable to appear, then time and space must both endure likewise, insofar as reason remains affirmative. But I ask, is God eternal? For God is synonymous with reason here, and reason appears impossible to transcend and dissipates. But if reason were to be annihilated and transcended from, then God would simultaneously be annihilated and transcended from. Thus the question whether he is eternal, for if he is, then reason is consequently impossible to transcend, that the principle of sufficient reason remains eternal, time and space remain affirmative, a subject must remain, in some way, shape, or form, enduring, objectified, and manifest, for a mode, vehicle, and method of subjective perception would necessarily be required, and therefore applied to itself, in order to obtain perception of the eternal forms, expressions, and representations of the will of God. If he is not eternal and everlasting, then the principle of sufficient reason is possible to transcend from and annihilate, that everlasting nothingness and perpetual rest may be obtained. But this is very unlikely, for as the process of consciousness illustrates for us, that the subject appears at times waking and sleeping, and during sleeping, dreaming and being dreamless. Taken as an analogy, even the state of dreamless sleep, that of which equates with our distinction of eternal rest and everlasting nothingness, returns the subject's body back into conscious states of either waking or dreaming sleep, that this process repeats redundantly throughout the subject's particular life sentence. But it seems here that, applying a metaphor with the subject experiencing states of somethingness and nothingness over time and again throughout the entirety of his phenomenal manifestation, the metaphor of absolute annihilation into nothingness is likely to be achieved eventually, if only the successive repetition of sleep during the subject's one singular life describes the various successive forms and reiterations that the subject's total life, universal soul, in its multiple transformations entails. Here I draw the distinction of Brahman, that the soul or universe is created and destroyed multiple times. This activity correlates with the subject's waking consciousness and dreamless sleep, respectively. Then finally, after 72-something cycles of reunification, the entire process is destroyed eternally. This correlates with the subject's death at the end of one of his phenomenal singular lives. At least this is the knowledge that I have gathered so far in my study of Hinduism and the life cycle of Brahman and the various yugas associated with him. So here, the hypothesis of God not being eternal retains still some credibility. If this is so, that reason is possible to end eventually, then it is provable that the principle of sufficient reason is not something perpetual or everlasting that it is possible to escape from and dissipate, if only the direct and indirect consequence of this would be perpetual timelessness and nothingness, forever and for all remaining eternity. Here skepticism gains its footing, as none of this speculation can be certified or affirmed with certainty and confidence. It is pleasurable to speculate on such matter, as well it seems to quiet the soul and calm a few irrational aspects of the mind. Thus, if no solution may be reached, still the effects obtained from such investigation may remain beneficial and purifying to the contents of the soul of man. In any event, it seems possible that all this focus upon knowledge of one universe may in fact be insufficient, that couples along with the above-mentioned notion that the Absolute goes through many forms until it is ultimately destroyed, the very forms of representation themselves may appear analogously to make up the notion of multiple universes, that every form, a form that is possible to objectify, again such a form is limited and finite, appears as each one atom. Likewise, each form appears as one universe. The two conceptions, atom and universe, go hand in hand, and are synonymous with each other, and are capable of representing the same idea at once. Now, one form or idea represents one universe. There is a void that is demonstrable through investigation into atomic matter microscopically, and as such beyond the universe there is likewise a void outside of it as well, that this one particular universe represents one particular atom within a telescopic void of many other universe particles, or of many other molecular components. All of these parts and components coalesce and form together to create a great transcendent picture, image, and representation of a higher, more celestial grade of reason. All of the universes that are a part of this grand picture, and which are perceived as mere atoms by the giants that likely inhabit the greater universe, are governed each by one subject that manifests the soul of consciousness within his particular universe sphere. It is such this way, for it must be mentioned here, albeit a little late, that through the means of our speculation into phenomenology, we have come to prefer the possibility of reason in God and such being finite, limited, and temporary, that, like Brahman supposedly extinguishing himself after 72 successive reiterations of life force, coupled with the possibility that every aspect of the principle of sufficient reason can be foretold and known by the subject, only insofar as the subject is capable of knowing it, that it is actually possible to achieve absolute knowledge of his universe, if only he were wise enough to perceive it, so that with the potential of absolute knowledge being ascertained in the subject's consciousness and universe, there it again is upheld and supported the notion that reality, as we commonly know it, is no more than a delusion and a false trap, that the basis of universal fundamental principles motion is, if not in fact actually occurring, at least not when perceiving the universe from up higher in position and having it imaginatively transcendent, coupled with the notion that the absolute center of the particular universe is forever unmoved and static, that this proportion represents the aspects of the prime mover somewhere else up higher, are found within a governing man. All this coalesces and forms together the synthesis that the universe as it is commonly known is in fact no more than a nervous, energetic atom, when perceived from the greater grade of reason, that this atomic form of the universe is ultimately solid, to some degree definite and potent, insofar as the thing itself represents ultimately one of the elements of the greater grade of reason. One universe may represent ultimately a fire element, a water, an air, or an earth element, and so forth, all accordingly through which the overall condition of the universe at one given singular time represents generally that particular element. Perhaps the universe is rubbed by a giant from above, friction is started, the universe is generated on fire, or a giant could be crying out at one given point in time, for whatever reason, if he ever cries to begin with, and thus a universe is transformed into an overall general water element coming from his tears. It must be mentioned as well that time is slowed radically in the greater grades of reason, space is tremendously enlarged as well, and causation is enormously more complicated and unintelligible, all of these conditions as they are perceived to a lesser grade of man. This particular universe, as I know it, and as my fellow brethren experience it, is likely governed by all of us, with each individual, possibly each man, woman, beast, cattle, insect, fish, plant, mineral, being given our own station or center of command in neighboring universes, all of which at present exemplify a similar grade or level of size, speed, complication, and intelligence. Thus we do not experience giants as though they were comprehensible to us, for they are too big. They make up the atoms that equate with all of our universes. One point that should be mentioned, it becomes increasingly harder to clarify as to exactly how many universes are being governed on our level or rank. All I need to inquire is, where is the line drawn as to what subjects are permitted to govern their universes? For instance, there is easily evident a limited number of men and women, beast, cattle, insect, fish, plant material within this world, that each of the individual subjects composing these categories retain a universe in command for themselves. But what after this? We descend to the mineral realm and immediately become confused, as there are so many individual parts of rocks, stones, metals, ores, and such, all capable of crumbling and dividing. Will a universe be destroyed upon a stone's destruction, or must we go to extreme lengths and allow the notion that every atom upon this world, in fact we must go further, every atom within this universe that is enclosed by the void, makes up a universe atom, every star, planet, galaxy, nebulae as well, every object of consciousness, one that can be delineated or more or less observed conscious, which essentially everything is, and one that composes of a mere atomic particle itself, constitutes a universe within this grade of reason. What of perhaps two bonded atoms? Will two universes manifest, or one? I believe the answer is three universe atoms, one for each other, and one for their bondage. Thus, with this logic carried through more completely, it seems that a universe appears from almost every kind of combination of atomic particles, altogether, separately, and combined. The delineation seems to be infinite and incapable of resolution. Thus the universes appear to be essentially infinite, that matter, given a part of this particular grade of reason, is virtually endless and fully capable of reiteration and redefinition. But what of zooming in further into the lower grade of reason, that of which appears to us each atom in our grade of universal reason is composed of its own atoms? Again, logically followed, the atomic matter is probably infinite, so that a universe above ours would necessarily be created by even a universe below ours, and so on and so forth to infinity. The procession would follow to smaller grades of reason, with their universes composing of parts and components of even greater and greater grades of universal reason, so forth to infinity. The elements of infinity is so great in this context that perhaps a boundary is drawn somewhere, a limit placed, otherwise a very radical and volatile chaos would likely ensue. Perhaps, to make things simpler for reason, a cap is used, a ground of limitation, somehow, in some way, for the lowest grade of universal reason. I prefer the notion of limiting the various grades to the various sephira of the tree of life, with 10 Malkut being the lowest, most insubstantial and murky of the enumerations, to 1 Keter being the highest, greatest, most supernatural of the elements. Perhaps one governing soul of one grade of universal reason at a given time is permitted to gain first-hand access into an absolute knowing perspective. This hypothesis seems to resolve the endless mystery of whether I am the only subject alive or not during this particular lifetime of mine. Rather, instead, it is understood that all the others apart of me within this particular universal grade are not in fact alive, conscious, real, and such, but rather, instead, they each have their own moments of phenomenal self-occupation. Perhaps I die during this life and on this grade, but then form again into this other life on this same grade for many occasions, until enough time is passed through the many forms and enough experience and knowledge is gained in order to transcend up to the higher realms or grades of universal reason. All other life forms that were not given first-hand access to an absolute knowing perspective until this time are ultimately recognized as phantoms, or mere dead weights, that their universe spheres represent likely the earth elements to the Gins more consistently than other times. The grade of 10 Malkut seems to represent the beginning of Brahman's life. Here we reason that nothing is eternal so long as its knowledge is eventually achieved. There exist certain curious and peculiar Hindu calculations in regard to the mathematical certified lifetime of Brahman himself, that a certain particular number designates one yuga, another number designates his years of life and death, the number of times that he experiences this life and death, and ultimately the total number that encapsulates the length of his lives and deaths, which is breathtaking in its immensity, concerning billions or trillions of years in length, that even here now, with this knowledge calculated through curious means, the position that his lifetime is currently undergoing and is now within can in fact credibly be certified and affirmed, if only the knowledge of this information was present to me at the moment. However, if I did have access to this knowledge, perhaps I would return with this successfully another time. I would almost definitely be able to reason sufficiently the numerical length that of which Brahman or God's Son endures during each and every one of the enumerations of the Sephirah. rather during each of the grades of universal reason that which the subject appears into accordingly, so that here in 10 Malkuth the time succeeds rather quickly. It is also here in this grade that all matter is dirt, indissoluble and firm. No atomic particles may be examined any more closely within this grade. There is a sense of death within the particles, even if they do appear, which they likely do as I correct myself on this, but the universes within these atoms of the Malkuth grade are nothing but dead weight and grounded matter. Rather, it seems possibly that time, in fact, runs very slow here in this grade, but space is very small and limited. Both of these qualities bear their conception from the illustration that I have in mind of the tree of life itself. I prefer to associate this knowledge of a tree sprouting and germinating from the ground, that upon examination into virtually any growth of a tree in nature, the seed and roots take the longest and slowest to grow and mature. The Malkuth grade thus coincides with this lengthy and slow sense of maturation. Time is not necessarily perceived as slow in the lower grades, and faster in the higher, smaller in the lower grades, greater in the higher. All analogous correspondence to the life and death of a tree found exemplified in nature. The tree scatters its seeds upon its springtime, the height of its representation, possibly 6 Teberet. By the time of Chokmah Keter, death is impending. What once was will soon be no more, at least in regard to this one particular tree's life. The seeds that were scattered during this golden age are now at this point in time fermenting within the soil, ready to burst into new forms. Where exactly is the soil and forest of trees? It seems that, with the irrefutable knowledge of the Kabbalah, with the total life course of Brahman is similar to that of a tree, as the Kabbalah represents this aspect most fundamentally. Perhaps the location of these objects are found in the soul of Brahman himself. Within each and every one of the life trees and generations, a total life course completes itself. Seeds from the prior golden age remain planted and ready to conceive another life course. So possibly that with every total life course completing itself, regeneration commences initially somewhat higher upon the grade of universal reason, no longer needing to start off within and dwell so intensively upon the lower grades, for the seeds are refining themselves now, becoming wiser and more complete. However, by the final time of Teberet, seeds are scattered, and a life course commences immediately starting at 5 Geburah. This proceeds to its conclusion. Then a life course commences immediately upon 4 Kesed, proceeding to its conclusion. This speculation is only in regard to illustrating more completely the possibility of total life courses resembling a tree found in nature, or drawing influence from the central idea of the Kabbalah itself, thus the tree of life. In any event, the particles examined in the grade of 10 Malkuth are dead matter. The boundary between 1 Keter is Ein sub R, a limitless recollection of the light once emanating from Keter. It is not eternal, however. It is achieved and endured for a time. Yes, however, it is likely that the course of life from 10 Malkuth to 1 Keter must complete itself, I am assuming from Hindu knowledge and mythology, 72 times before Ein in itself is achieved permanently. On another note, this entire system of expressing various life courses through the means of the Kabbalah may possibly and successfully be illustrated through the means of the zodiac as well, with Pisces being the initial life commencement, and with Arius being the final. This is all speculation, however. Much of this, if not all, is not provable, although I find this credible and likable, as men are ultimately skeptical upon inquiring into this level of reasoning. Therefore, they remove their skepticism and pave the road toward enlightenment through whatever means suits their fantasy. It brings their souls closer in connection to God or reason, therefore is something desirable to affirm. I love knowledge, particularly wisdom, and I think that exploring this particular subject matter brings altogether greater ideas with aid and contribution to the evolution and spiritual advancements of the human race. More will be written on this subject matter, certainly. July 7, 2012. Seven 2012. Solitary crisis and final effect. This writing stems from a somber conversation that I have had earlier this afternoon with my good friend, one that of which is conceived literally as a recognition of the most bitter disappointments, having lately put forth enough artistic effort to produce 2 70 minutes, I must say, extremely good improvisations extremely good improvisations. I shall judge this by comparison of prior works that I have done, of which these two latest pieces I think are incredible improvements and refinements from so many works since past, and having received almost a totally ignorant and indifferent response from others, of which online the videos have been made available for them, acquiring not even a few views, I became finally and at last rather impatient and frustrated with the present, the very lonely and ill-conceived situation. Fortunately, I have enough an understanding within me still in that this form of principle is reason to the fact that men by nature are inevitably going to experience this solitary crisis, that this person is not at fault or mistaken or disliked with sufficient reason, rather he is manifested in an already degenerating state in being. This I refer to societal means. Others are becoming increasingly oblivious to the bud of salvation, and distract themselves with fleeting and irrelevant hedonism. No more care or interest in the refinement and comprehension of great and complicated art or philosophy or such is to be found in the multitude, that is, in an extraordinary amount of particular individual cases. Thus I may quell my frustration from time to time, yet within this passage here documented that follows, I certainly show myself to the appearance of despair and even rage, for the helpless and solitary condition that I see myself experiencing proves itself to be most hurtful to my esteem and conscience during this discursive meditation. Nevertheless, a sober and deep recognition that I'm probably in truth all alone in this world of mine, or at least while situated here within the western ground of spirit, which is likely for life eternal, is vital to be understood and dissolved. Otherwise, the fury within me does not contain itself, and eventually it turns practical to all an extremely undesired effect. This writing is bitter and resentful, however it is a clear reflection of perhaps what a good case of genuine artistic potency turns into for a moment. When all is said and done, nothing remains desirable to preserve, as not another soul shows any acknowledgment for this artist's much laboured and timelessly discerning works, as it has come to turn out in my own case as of recently. I have read my friend's very insightful statements in regard to the seeming necessity for complete silence from others that concern my artwork and efforts. I agree with her completely. I would experience many occasions of doubt and uncertainty that perhaps I am the one at fault here, when time after time again I recognize most clearly now that this is not in fact the case whatsoever. Merely I am living in a decadent age and empire bent on its own degeneration and darkness into third world poverty within a few certain centuries of time, that I am almost totally alone in this infernal condition due to the mindlessness and indifferent apathy, the careless nihilism and fatalistic negativity of so many of the others, millions and millions of them, verifies my own posterior recognition that I am not wrong or purposely disliked or ignored for perhaps understandable reasons. This is not the case. Rather, I am looked over almost so soon by almost the total multitude of Western citizens, simply for the reason described above, that my artwork stands in difficult and natural opposition to the stream or current spirit of the dying Western mind, for the music and writing of mine are immediate objects of misunderstanding, confusion, and laborious intellectual activity for the others, those many subjects that merely do not grasp at once any more than a 3-minute banter of pop triviality, or to apprehend a short story or fairy tale written at the level of a 90-year-old, rather than to even so much as to gaze at and give a moment's worth attention to the salvation of man, that of which the works of mine, among other giants of music, philosophy, poetry, and so forth, imagine to create, share, and compose among one another. If this even legitimately occurs any more, I wonder. The idea of scholarship within this realm of thought, the internet, or at least coming across the experience of a scholar, even potentially, is an immense unlikelihood now. Almost every intellectual aspiration appears as pseudonymous and imitative. I and a few others, among these being myself a couple of my very good friends, whatever thinking spirits had as of yet not found by my own research, remain here in this obsolete post-apocalyptic frost. Nearly everyone else might as well be judged and condemned as zombies, for this is the condition that the liberal, tear-soaked morality ultimately devolves them into. The West is now history. All this pathetic talk of change and progression means nothing more than the death, forgetfulness, and moving on from prior European history and custom, from all and any true progress and achievement, from general and particular cultural enlightenment. Nihilism is at the door indeed, and has never been worse. This most uncanniest of guests will only degenerate further with the passage of successive time. I am the eternal cynic as well. I value my creations, and at the same time know that emptiness, silence, passing over, and denial of comprehension from others will only be met with by me, probably with everything that is sooner or later to come through my own effort. I understand truly that my potential, or even actual, audience is indeed sterile and sanitized, probably beyond hope of recovery by now. This state of involuntary solitude is indeed not by my action, conduct, or intention whatsoever. It is by the others, a part of a truly liberalized, stupefied, degenerated, and fleeting commercialist materialism that unifies under a feminine communist banner that, easily seen through and transparent, represents nothing more than hatred for the greater man, of the patrician, the praetorian, the imperator. Vengeance, jealousy, envy, resentment, and so forth account for their emotional intentions. Be them concealed or revealed, they become revealed more so with every passing moment. I find myself beginning to rejoice in the notion of systematic sovereign appointed manslaughter, particularly targeting the liberal. It is as though, if I am to try and attempt to acquire any audience, as I believe ever the more that this is futile to achieve, I become disappointed by their ineptness. I reason further that there are causes to this disappointment and necessary looking over by the others. In specific, it seems that the primary archetypal original cause to this condition is found in the Christ, and with time and following of these others, by that subject's example, the Enlightenment liberal eventually rears its ugly head with enough malediction and corruption of historical age. He now, if any primary cause of animosity that sources to my bleak and solitary condition remains today, that represents the living example of the Christ. Therefore, I see myself helplessly turning my internal aggression more and more onto this postmodern subject, for the Christ is deceased and more than history by now. The liberal is alive today and very well. Why not fantasize with the sadism and pleasure for the torment and destruction of the liberal himself, as he is found to this day? Therefore, I imagine more and more an established government that singles out the liberal and systematically executes him, chiefly in order to satisfy my desire and unnecessary aggression, that of which culminates by the day with every passing moment that I am not recognized and am looked over. I see his putrescence as the cause to his involuntary solitude. Rejoice, I say, in the blood of the liberal. How cathartic and purifying it would be to find and have executed one of my everlasting enemies. So much hatred rushed and released through pleasant sacrifice. I see that everybody hates at least somebody, that deep within the soul of even the most pious and apparently remorseful Christian there exists that insatiable and perpetual kernel of Schopenhauerian will, or reason as I have it, that cannot be tamed or extolled from malevolence or scourge. Therefore I speak openly on the deepest nature of man, of any man, without fear or sorrow, yet know at the same time that this instinctive drive to overcome these enemies, through justice or injustice, is rooted at bottom in the heart of every man. In any case, this blackness associates with the suffering of liberality, and those who openly and ambitiously aspire to that ideal. In others, perhaps their association stands in opposition to my kind and rejoices in the suffering of my own, the great majority, possibly soon to be the complete totality of Western mankind. Also, I do care less whether they aspire to do violence to me or not. I converge into the realm of political philosophy at this point in time, and say alle gegen alle, with each man to his own, eventually and ultimately within his own right measure. I and the few others similar like me form the thrust and activity of congruence and contingency with the opposition. We stand together in bond, aspire to attract and to acquire, in order to harvest enough support to eventually create that superior state and purge the empire of liberalism. Of course, this is all vain fantasy in the end, as it is the nature of the course and spirit of the West, as it culminates in its own prior acknowledged degeneration. I and the few others similar like me shall lose, as the representative hero born from the heavens can only and ultimately be met with disillusionment, and thus deceased in tragedy. I think that the preservation of my own kind, for as long as it is possible, is worthy of enough praise in my own solitary circle. Otherwise I might as well surrender to those enemies, the multitude of dumb citizens and brain-dead emasculates, that of which appear so strikingly to possess the correct morality, but in actuality and upon truthful exposure, they are suddenly recognized as no more than mere impostors and masked fakes, conspiring against all and anything that is real, alive, and possessed of truth, spirit, and masterful activity. There exist degrees of those others that are more real and more false. The vast multitude is false, as there can only be so many alive, awake, alert, and active spirits, in reference to metempsychosis in Eastern religious spiritual premises. Well, in any event, for now at least, I send my deepest respect and love with much abundance to my friend, and my most real, alive, and masterful companion. My admiration for her is forever and always unending and eternal. July 2012.